In 1952, at St. Mary's Hospital in rural Pennsylvania, a single decision made in the darkness of a delivery room would destroy two families and create a secret so devastating that it would consume the woman who made it for the next 4 decades of her life. Margaret Holbrook was 34 years old that November night when she made the choice that would haunt every remaining day of her existence. As the head nurse in the maternity ward, she had delivered over 800 babies during her 12-year career. She had seen joy and sorrow, miracle births and tragic losses, but she had never faced a situation that would test every moral boundary she believed she possessed, until the night when 2 babies were born within minutes of each other, and only she knew the truth about which child belonged to which family. The storm that raged outside St. Mary's that night seemed to mirror the chaos that was about to unfold within its walls. Rain lashed against the windows with violent intensity, and thunder shook the building's foundation as if nature itself was warning of the tragedy that was about to occur. The power had flickered twice during the early evening hours, and the backup generator hummed ominously in the basement, casting shadows that danced across the corridors like ghosts preparing to witness an unspeakable act. Mrs. Elizabeth Crane had arrived at the hospital at 8:47 p.m., her labor already well advanced. She was the wife of Robert Crane, owner of the largest manufacturing company in Lancaster County, and her arrival had been anticipated for weeks. The Cranes had been trying to conceive for 7 years, and this pregnancy represented their last hope for producing an heir to continue the family name and inherit the business empire that Robert had built from nothing during the post-war boom years. Elizabeth's previous pregnancies had ended in miscarriage, each loss devastating the couple further and adding pressure that transformed what should have been a joyful experience into a desperate gamble with fate. At 38 years old, Elizabeth understood that this might be her final opportunity to give Robert the son he desperately wanted, and the weight of those expectations had made her pregnancy a period of constant anxiety and careful monitoring by the best doctors money could secure. Less than an hour after Elizabeth's arrival, another woman was brought to the maternity ward under circumstances that could not have been more different. Sarah Mitchell was 19 years old, unmarried, and had hidden her pregnancy for 8 months from everyone in her small community except Margaret Holbrook, who had been secretly providing prenatal care in exchange for housekeeping services that helped Sarah survive during the final months of her pregnancy. Sarah's situation was desperate in ways that went beyond simple financial hardship. Her pregnancy was the result of rape by her stepfather, a respected member of the community whose reputation would be protected at all costs, while Sarah would be branded as a fallen woman whose child would face a lifetime of stigma and rejection. She had no family support, no financial resources, and no prospects for providing her child with anything resembling a stable future. Margaret had known both women for months, and she understood the cruel irony of their situations better than anyone else involved in the events of that November night. Elizabeth Crane possessed everything necessary to raise a child successfully: wealth, social position, a loving marriage, and a desperate desire for motherhood. Sarah Mitchell had nothing except her youth and the fierce love she felt for a baby whose existence would likely condemn them both to poverty and social ostracism. The moral complexity of the situation had been weighing on Margaret's mind for weeks as both pregnancies approached term. She had spent sleepless nights contemplating the injustice of a system that would give every advantage to one child while condemning another to circumstances that would likely result in suffering that could have been prevented through a single act of intervention. As the head nurse, Margaret possessed knowledge and authority that no one else in the hospital could claim. She understood the bureaucratic processes that governed birth certificates and medical records. She knew which doctors were likely to be called for emergency consultations and which procedures could be performed without attracting unwanted attention from supervisors or administrators. But most importantly, she understood that the storm raging outside had created conditions that might make the unthinkable not just possible, but perhaps morally necessary. Elizabeth Crane's labor progressed rapidly once she arrived at the hospital, but complications developed that threatened both mother and child. Her blood pressure spiked dangerously high, and signs of distress in the baby required immediate intervention to prevent tragedy. Dr. Harrison, the obstetrician, was called from his home during the worst of the storm, and his delayed arrival meant that Margaret was responsible for managing the delivery during its most critical stages. The child that finally emerged at 11:23 p.m. was healthy and perfect, with the robust cries that indicated strong lungs and vital signs that promised a successful transition from womb to world. But Elizabeth's condition remained precarious, requiring immediate medical attention that would keep her sedated and unaware of her surroundings for several hours after the birth. Robert Crane paced in the waiting room, chain-smoking cigarettes and checking his watch every few minutes as the storm continued its assault on the building. His anxiety was palpable, and Margaret could see through the glass partition that separated the maternity ward from the family areas that he was preparing himself for either the greatest joy or the most devastating loss of his life. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell's labor had begun almost simultaneously with Elizabeth's, but proceeded more smoothly despite the lack of family support or private medical attention. Sarah had requested that no one be notified of the birth, and the absence of anxious relatives in the waiting room meant that her delivery could proceed without the scrutiny and expectations that surrounded Elizabeth's situation. The child Sarah delivered at 11:31 p.m. was also healthy and strong, but Margaret noticed immediately that this baby's cries were slightly weaker, and his color was not as robust as the Crane infant. Nothing that indicated serious problems, but subtle signs that suggested this child might face health challenges that could be significant for a mother with limited resources and no access to quality medical care. As Margaret cleaned and examined both babies in the nursery during the early morning hours, she found herself studying their faces and comparing their features in ways that went beyond standard medical assessment. Both infants were male, both had similar coloring and weight, and both possessed the kind of generic newborn appearance that made distinguishing between them more difficult than it would be in a few weeks when their individual characteristics became more pronounced. The thought that had been haunting her for months suddenly crystallized into a possibility that seemed both horrifying and miraculous. What if these children could trade places? What if the baby who would inherit wealth and privilege could be exchanged with the baby who was destined for poverty and illegitimacy? Would such an exchange represent an unforgivable violation of natural order, or would it be an act of justice that corrected the arbitrary cruelty of circumstances beyond anyone's control? The decision, when it finally came, seemed to make itself. Margaret found herself moving between the two cribs with a purposefulness that felt both alien and inevitable. The hospital's identification systems in 1952 were far less sophisticated than they would become in later decades. Footprints were taken, but they were often smudged or incomplete. Wristbands could be switched. Records could be altered by someone with the right knowledge and access. As dawn approached and the storm began to subside, Margaret completed the exchange that would define the rest of her life. The child born to Elizabeth Crane was placed in the bassinet marked for Sarah Mitchell's baby, while Sarah's son was prepared for presentation to the Cranes as their long-awaited heir. The weight of what she had done settled on Margaret's shoulders like a physical burden that would grow heavier with each passing day. She had violated every ethical principle that governed her profession. She had manipulated the fate of two families based on her own judgment about what constituted justice. She had created a deception that would require constant vigilance to maintain, and that could destroy multiple lives if it were ever discovered. But as she watched Robert Crane's face transform with joy when she placed the baby in his arms, and as she witnessed Sarah Mitchell's relief when she was told that adoption arrangements had been made for her child by a wealthy family who would provide him with every opportunity for success, Margaret felt a satisfaction that transcended guilt and regret. She had used her position and knowledge to address an injustice that would have otherwise condemned one child to unnecessary suffering while blessing another with unearned advantages. The moral complexity of her actions would torment her for decades, but the immediate results seemed to confirm that sometimes the right choice is not the same as the legal or conventional choice. The babies Margaret had switched that night would grow up in circumstances that were completely opposite to those intended by the accident of their birth. One would know privilege and opportunity while carrying genes that connected him to poverty and desperation. The other would face hardship and disadvantage while possessing the biological heritage that should have guaranteed him wealth and social position. Neither child would ever know the truth about their origins, but Margaret would carry the secret like a weight that grew heavier with each birthday celebration, each graduation, each wedding, and each grandchild that extended the consequences of her decision into future generations. She could never have imagined. The truth she had buried that November night in 1952 would remain hidden for 40 years, protected by her silence and the careful destruction of records that might have revealed what had really happened during those crucial hours when two families and destinies were secretly exchanged. But secrets have a way of demanding acknowledgement, and the price of maintaining such a profound deception would ultimately exceed anything Margaret could have anticipated when she made her choice in the darkness of a storm-ravaged night. What began as an act of desperate compassion would evolve into a lifetime of guilt, fear, and the terrible knowledge that love, when it motivates people to play God with other people's lives, can create consequences that are both beautiful and monstrous in their complexity. The children she had switched would live their entire lives as strangers to their own blood, while she would spend 4 decades watching the results of her intervention unfold, understanding better than anyone else involved the true cost of the mercy she had shown to 2 families who would never know they had been the recipients of her secret sacrifice. But the story Margaret thought she was writing that night was not the story that would actually unfold over the following decades. Because the truth about genetic inheritance, family bonds, and the power of secrets to shape human lives in unexpected ways would prove to be far more complicated than anything she had anticipated when she made her choice to switch 2 babies who seemed to have been born into the wrong families. The weight of hidden truth would grow heavier with each passing year, until the burden of maintaining her secret would threaten to destroy not just Margaret herself, but everyone she had tried to protect through her intervention. The decision she made in 1952 would echo through 4 decades of carefully maintained lies, until events beyond her control would force a reckoning that would reveal the true price of playing God with the lives of innocent children. The months following the switch revealed to Margaret the true complexity of what she had set in motion that November night. Maintaining the deception required a level of vigilance and emotional control that she had not anticipated, as every interaction with both families became a performance designed to protect secrets that could destroy multiple lives if exposed. Robert Crane's joy in his son was infectious and heartbreaking in equal measure. The child Margaret had given him thrived under the care and attention that unlimited resources could provide, developing into a robust and alert infant whose obvious health and vitality vindicated Robert's faith in his family's future. Margaret watched this development during her regular pediatric visits to the Crane household, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and guilt that grew more intense with each milestone the child achieved. Meanwhile, the baby who had been born to the Cranes was being raised by foster parents who had been chosen specifically for their discretion and their ability to provide stable care without asking uncomfortable questions about the child's origins. Margaret had arranged this placement through connections in the social services system, using her reputation and professional relationships to ensure that Sarah Mitchell's biological child would receive proper care while maintaining the fiction that he was the unwanted offspring of an unmarried woman who could not provide for him herself. Sarah Mitchell had accepted the story Margaret had created about her child's adoption with a relief that was both touching and tragic. The young woman had been so overwhelmed by the circumstances of her pregnancy and her complete lack of resources that the prospect of knowing her child would be raised by a wealthy family seemed like an answer to prayers she had not dared to voice. Her gratitude to Margaret for arranging this solution was genuine and heartfelt, but it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what had actually occurred. The psychological toll of maintaining these interlocking deceptions began to manifest in Margaret's behavior within weeks of the switch. Her colleagues at St. Mary's noticed that she had become more withdrawn and prone to periods of distraction that were uncharacteristic of her normally precise and focused professional demeanor. Her supervisor, Dr. Patricia Henley, expressed concerns about Margaret's apparent stress levels and suggested that she might benefit from a vacation or a reduced work schedule. But Margaret understood that any significant change in her routine could potentially expose her to questions or situations that might threaten the carefully constructed fiction she had created. She needed to maintain her position at the hospital to monitor any developments that might affect either child's situation, and she needed to continue her involvement with both families to ensure that no suspicious circumstances arose that could prompt investigations into the events of that November night. The first serious challenge to Margaret's deception came when both children were 6 months old and their distinct personalities began to emerge in ways that might have revealed inconsistencies to someone who was looking for them. The child being raised as Robert Crane's son displayed a temperament that was notably different from what might have been expected based on the personalities of his supposed parents. While Robert was gregarious and outgoing, and Elizabeth was refined but socially confident, their supposed son was unusually quiet and observant, with a tendency towards solitary play that struck both parents as somewhat unusual. Conversely, the child in foster care exhibited energy and social curiosity that seemed to exceed what might have been anticipated from someone born into Sarah Mitchell's circumstances. His foster mother, Mrs. Dorothy Weiss, commented to Margaret during one of her visits that the baby seemed unusually responsive to social interaction and showed signs of intelligence that she found remarkable in someone so young. These observations were not significant enough to raise serious questions, but they reminded Margaret that genetic traits have ways of asserting themselves regardless of environmental circumstances, and that the longer the deception continued, the more likely it became that someone would notice patterns that didn't quite match their expectations. The situation became more complicated when Robert Crane began to express concerns about his son's development that went beyond normal parental anxiety. At 10 months old, the child had not yet begun to walk or speak with the precocity that Robert had expected from his heir, and several comments from family friends about the baby's reserved demeanor had planted seeds of doubt that Robert was trying to suppress but could not entirely dismiss. Margaret found herself in the position of providing reassurance to Robert about his child's development, while simultaneously knowing that any unusual traits the boy displayed were actually inherited from Sarah Mitchell's genetic line, rather than from the Crane family history. Her medical expertise allowed her to offer credible explanations for the child's characteristics, but each conversation increased her awareness of how precarious her position was becoming. The psychological pressure of maintaining these lies began to affect Margaret's health in ways that went beyond simple stress and fatigue. She developed insomnia that left her exhausted during the day, and her appetite disappeared to the point where colleagues began commenting on her obvious weight loss. Dr. Henley called Margaret into her office for a formal discussion about her condition and insisted that she undergo a comprehensive medical examination to rule out serious health problems. During this examination, Margaret's physician, Dr. Robert Foster, identified elevated blood pressure and signs of chronic anxiety that he attributed to occupational stress, but that Margaret knew were directly related to the secret she was carrying. Dr. Foster prescribed medication and recommended that Margaret consider changing her career focus to something less demanding than maternity ward nursing, advice that Margaret found impossible to follow without potentially compromising her ability to monitor the situation she had created. The first anniversary of the switch passed without incident, but it marked the beginning of a new phase in Margaret's psychological experience of her secret. The initial adrenaline and sense of moral urgency that had motivated her decision had faded, replaced by a grinding awareness that she had committed herself to a lifetime of deception that would require constant vigilance and emotional control. The children were now walking and beginning to develop language skills that made their distinct personalities more apparent to everyone around them. Robert Crane III, as the boy was now known, remained quiet and thoughtful, with a tendency to observe his surroundings carefully before acting. His movements were deliberate, and his speech, when it emerged, was careful and precise in ways that reminded Margaret more of Sarah Mitchell's cautious personality than of either of his supposed parents' more confident social styles. The child in foster care, who had been named Michael Weiss after his foster father, displayed energy and curiosity that seemed to demand constant attention and stimulation. His physical coordination was excellent, and his social skills were developing rapidly in ways that suggested he would grow into the kind of charismatic personality that Robert Crane had hoped to see in his biological heir. These contrasts became more pronounced as both children approached their second birthday, and Margaret began to understand that the differences in their personalities might eventually create problems that could expose her deception if anyone ever had reason to compare them directly or investigate their backgrounds thoroughly. The situation reached a crisis point when Elizabeth Crane became pregnant again in the spring of 1954. This development created both opportunities and dangers for Margaret's secret, as the arrival of a second child would provide a genetic comparison that might reveal inconsistencies in Robert III's supposed heredity, while also potentially diverting attention from questions about his unusual characteristics. Margaret monitored Elizabeth's pregnancy with the same intensity she had devoted to observing both children's development, understanding that the birth of a legitimate Crane heir could either strengthen her deception by providing cover for Robert III's atypical traits, or expose it by creating genetic contrasts that no amount of creative explanation could account for. Elizabeth's second pregnancy proceeded smoothly, but Margaret's anxiety about its implications increased as the due date approached. She had spent 2 years perfecting the performance required to maintain her secret, but the addition of a new family member, who would share Robert and Elizabeth's genuine genetic heritage, would create complexities that she was not certain she could navigate successfully. The psychological preparation required for managing this new challenge forced Margaret to confront the long-term implications of her decision in ways that she had avoided during the first 2 years after the switch. She was beginning to understand that the children would eventually grow old enough to ask questions about their family histories, their genetic heritage, and their places within their respective families' lineages. Robert III would inherit wealth and social position that should have belonged to Michael, but he would do so while carrying genetic traits that connected him to Sarah Mitchell's family history rather than to the Crane bloodline. Michael would grow up in circumstances that were far removed from the privilege he had been born to inherit, but he would develop characteristics that reflected his actual parentage in ways that might eventually become impossible to ignore or explain away. Margaret's role as the keeper of these secrets was becoming more burdensome as the children developed into individuals with their own personalities and needs, rather than the abstract concepts they had represented when she made her decision during that storm-ravaged night in 1952. She was no longer dealing with the theoretical consequences of switching 2 babies. She was living with the daily reality of watching 2 specific children grow up in circumstances that were fundamentally different from what their biological inheritance should have determined. The weight of this responsibility was compounded by her growing awareness that neither child was developing in exactly the way she had anticipated when she made her choice. Robert III's reserved nature and careful personality were creating concerns among his supposed parents that might eventually lead to investigations or consultations that could expose the truth about his origins. Michael's energy and social confidence were impressing his foster parents in ways that might eventually attract attention from people who could recognize the significance of his apparent genetic gifts. By the time Elizabeth Crane entered her 3rd trimester, Margaret had reached a state of chronic anxiety that was affecting every aspect of her life and career. The approaching birth of a legitimate Crane child represented both the ultimate test of her deception and the beginning of a new level of complexity that would require even more sophisticated lies and performances to maintain. She understood that the next few months would determine whether the fiction she had created could survive the scrutiny that would inevitably accompany the arrival of Robert and Elizabeth's biological child, or whether the genetic and personality contrasts that emerged would finally expose the truth about what had happened on that November night when she had decided to play God with the lives of 2 families who trusted her completely. The decision she had made in a moment of desperate compassion was evolving into a lifetime commitment that was testing her psychological resources in ways that she had never anticipated. The children she had tried to protect through her intervention were growing into individuals whose needs and circumstances were becoming more complex with each passing month, and her ability to manage the consequences of her choice was being challenged by factors that no amount of planning could have predicted or controlled. The approaching crisis would force Margaret to confront the possibility that the greatest act of love she had ever attempted might ultimately become the source of greater suffering than the injustices she had tried to correct, and that the secrets she had guarded so carefully might need to be revealed in order to prevent the destruction of the very people she had sacrificed so much to protect. Elizabeth Crane's 2nd pregnancy culminated on March 18, 1955. With the birth of a daughter who would unknowingly become the key to unraveling Margaret's carefully constructed deception. The baby girl, named Victoria Crane, possessed features that were unmistakably inherited from both her parents, creating a genetic roadmap that would eventually expose the truth about her older brother's origins. Margaret assisted with Victoria's delivery, and the moment she saw the infant's face, she understood that her secret had entered its most dangerous phase. Victoria's eyes were the same pale blue as Robert's. Her chin had Elizabeth's distinctive cleft, and her hair color matched family photographs that decorated the Crane household. She was, in every visible way, the product of her parents' combined genetic heritage. The contrast with Robert III became apparent immediately to anyone who saw both children together. While Victoria displayed obvious family resemblances, Robert III's features remained distinctly different, with darker eyes, different bone structure, and coloring that suggested genetic influences that had no connection to either supposed parent. These differences had been easy to dismiss when Robert III was the only child, but Victoria's arrival created a living comparison that made his atypical appearance impossible to ignore. Robert Crane's reaction to his daughter's birth revealed the depth of his subconscious concerns about his son's development. His joy in Victoria was uncomplicated and enthusiastic, free from the subtle anxieties that had characterized his relationship with Robert III. Margaret watched this dynamic develop during her postpartum visits to the Crane household and recognized that Robert's unconscious responses were beginning to reflect genetic realities that he could not consciously acknowledge. Meanwhile, Michael Weiss had celebrated his third birthday in foster care, and his development was creating its own set of complications for Margaret's secret. His foster mother, Dorothy Weiss, had begun expressing concerns about his advanced abilities and his need for educational opportunities that exceeded what their modest household could provide. Michael was reading at a level appropriate for children twice his age, and his curiosity about complex subjects was creating challenges that his foster parents were not equipped to address. More troubling for Margaret was Dorothy's growing suspicion that Michael's biological parents must have possessed exceptional intelligence and education. Several comments during their regular visits suggested that Dorothy was beginning to wonder about the circumstances that had led to such a gifted child being placed for adoption, and her questions were becoming more pointed in ways that made Margaret increasingly uncomfortable. The situation reached a crisis point during Victoria's first birthday celebration in March 1956. The party brought together extended family members who had not seen Robert III for several months, and their reactions to the differences between the siblings created the kind of sustained scrutiny that Margaret had been dreading for 4 years. Robert's brother, William Crane, was a physician who possessed the observational skills and medical knowledge that made him particularly dangerous to Margaret's secret. During the party, she watched William study both children with the clinical attention of someone trained to notice genetic patterns and anomalies. His conversations with Robert about the children's development contained subtle questions that suggested he was beginning to recognize inconsistencies that could not be easily explained. The most dangerous moment came when William commented directly on the lack of family resemblance between Robert III and his parents, framing his observation in terms of genetics education that he thought might reassure Robert about what he clearly perceived as unusual circumstances. "Sometimes genetic expression can be quite unpredictable, Robert," William said during a private conversation that Margaret overheard while serving refreshments. "Children don't always display obvious family traits, especially during early development. But I have to say, Robert III's coloring and bone structure are quite different from what I would expect based on your and Elizabeth's characteristics. Have you considered consulting with a pediatric geneticist? Not because there's anything wrong, but just to understand the inheritance patterns that might be involved." Robert's response revealed that William's comments had touched on concerns that had been growing in his mind for months. "I've wondered about that myself, William. He's healthy and intelligent, and that's what matters most. But you're right that he doesn't look much like either Elizabeth or me. I suppose there could be recessive traits from previous generations that we're not aware of. Family histories aren't always complete, especially going back several generations." This conversation terrified Margaret because it suggested that genetic testing or detailed family research might be considered as ways to explain Robert III's atypical appearance. Such investigations would inevitably reveal that the child had no biological connection to the Crane family line, exposing not just her deception, but creating legal and emotional consequences that could destroy multiple lives. Her anxiety was compounded by developments in Michael's situation that were creating their own pressures for revelation. Dorothy Weiss had begun making inquiries about educational programs for gifted children, and her research had connected her with social workers who were questioning the limited information available about Michael's background. The story Margaret had created about his origins was beginning to seem insufficient to professionals who specialized in child placement and family history. The turning point came in the fall of 1956, when both children were approaching their 5th birthdays and their distinct personalities had evolved to the point where concealing their true circumstances was requiring increasingly complex deceptions. Robert III had developed into a thoughtful, artistic child who showed little interest in the business activities that were supposed to define his future as the Crane heir. His preferences for quiet activities and his sensitivity to social dynamics were creating confusion among family members who expected him to display the aggressive confidence that characterized successful entrepreneurs. Michael, meanwhile, had begun asking his foster parents direct questions about his biological family that they could not answer satisfactorily. His advanced cognitive abilities had enabled him to understand that his circumstances were unusual, and his questions about his origins were becoming more sophisticated and persistent. Dorothy Weiss had started contacting Margaret more frequently, seeking additional information that could help her respond to Michael's inquiries. The crisis that Margaret had been dreading for 5 years finally emerged when Michael's questions prompted Dorothy to request a meeting with his original caseworker to review the documentation from his placement. The investigation that followed revealed inconsistencies in the paperwork that Margaret had hastily created during those first weeks after the switch, and the Social Services Department began asking questions that threatened to expose the entire deception. Margaret found herself trapped between multiple investigations that were converging on the truth from different directions. William Crane's medical curiosity about Robert III's genetic background was leading toward consultations that would reveal the child's lack of biological connection to his supposed parents. The Social Services review of Michael's placement was uncovering documentation problems that could expose the fictional nature of his adoption story. And both children were developing personalities and abilities that were beginning to reflect their actual genetic heritage in ways that were becoming impossible to explain through environmental factors alone. The psychological pressure of managing these simultaneous threats to her secret pushed Margaret to the breaking point. Her health deteriorated rapidly during the late months of 1956, and her behavior became erratic enough to raise concerns among her colleagues at St. Mary's Hospital. Dr. Henley called Margaret into her office for a confrontational meeting about her performance problems and demanded an explanation for the changes in her professional conduct. Unable to reveal the true source of her distress, Margaret attempted to attribute her problems to general burnout from years of demanding work in the maternity ward. But Dr. Henley was not satisfied with this explanation and insisted that Margaret undergo psychological evaluation as a condition of continued employment. The prospect of psychiatric examination created new fears for Margaret, who understood that trained professionals might recognize signs of the guilt and anxiety that were consuming her. The situation became even more complex when Elizabeth Crane announced a third pregnancy in early 1957. The prospect of another legitimate Crane child would create additional genetic comparisons that would make Robert III's anomalous appearance even more obvious to family members who were already beginning to notice inconsistencies. Margaret realized that the birth of a second biological child would likely precipitate investigations that would expose her deception within months of the delivery. Her desperation led her to consider options that she had never contemplated during the 5 years since making her original decision. The possibility of revealing the truth voluntarily began to seem preferable to waiting for discovery through investigations that would expose not just the switch, but the deliberate nature of her deception and the elaborate lies she had constructed to maintain it. But the complexity of unwinding 5 years of carefully maintained fiction presented challenges that seemed almost insurmountable. Both children had formed identities based on the circumstances Margaret had created for them. Robert III saw himself as the heir to a business empire and had developed relationships with family members who loved him as their own. Michael had bonded with his foster parents and had begun to think of their modest household as his real family. Revealing the truth would require not just admitting to her deception, but destroying the emotional foundations that both children had built their sense of self upon. The psychological damage that could result from such revelations might exceed the benefits that Margaret had originally hoped to provide through her intervention. The decision about whether to confess voluntarily or risk discovery through ongoing investigations became the central focus of Margaret's existence during the early months of 1957. Every day brought new evidence that her secret was becoming impossible to maintain. But the consequences of revelation seemed potentially catastrophic for everyone involved. The weight of choosing between continued deception and controlled disclosure was complicated by her growing awareness that both children were developing in ways that reflected their actual genetic potential rather than the circumstances of their upbringing. Robert III's artistic temperament and sensitivity were traits that he had inherited from Sarah Mitchell's family line, while Michael's intellectual curiosity and social confidence were expressions of the Crane genetic heritage that should have been his birthright. These developments suggested that biological inheritance might be asserting itself regardless of environmental influences, and that the children might eventually discover their true origins through their own development, even if Margaret's deception was never officially exposed. The possibility that they would spend their entire lives feeling like strangers in their own families was beginning to seem more psychologically damaging than the trauma that would result from learning the truth about their switched identities. Margaret's recognition that her well-intentioned intervention might ultimately cause more harm than the injustices she had tried to correct created a crisis of conscience that threatened her sanity. She had spent 5 years believing that she had performed an act of mercy that had protected 2 children from circumstances that would have damaged their potential for happy and successful lives. But the reality of watching them develop into individuals who were increasingly out of place in their assigned roles was forcing her to confront the possibility that her decision had been fundamentally misguided. The approach of Elizabeth's third pregnancy's term in late 1957 created urgency around decisions that Margaret could no longer postpone. The birth of another legitimate Crane child would make Robert III's genetic anomalies impossible to ignore, while the ongoing social services investigation into Michael's background was approaching revelations that would expose the fictional nature of his placement. Margaret understood that she was facing the most critical decision of her life, and that the choice she made would determine not just her own fate, but the future happiness and psychological health of 2 children who had never asked to be the subjects of her desperate experiment in correcting genetic and social injustice. The storm that had raged outside St. Mary's Hospital on the night she made her original decision seemed to pale in comparison to the tempest of consequences that was now approaching, threatening to destroy not just the deception she had maintained for 5 years, but the lives of everyone she had tried to protect through her intervention. The time for secrets was ending, and the price of the truth was about to be revealed in ways that would test whether love, even when motivated by the most compassionate intentions, could justify the manipulation of human destiny on the scale that Margaret had attempted. The children she had switched were approaching the moment when they would learn that their entire sense of identity had been built upon a foundation of lies that had shaped every day of their existence since birth. The revelation that was coming would either vindicate Margaret's belief that she had performed an act of mercy, or condemn her for playing God with the lives of innocent people who had trusted her completely. The truth about what had happened on that November night in 1952 was about to emerge from the darkness where it had been hidden, and its exposure would change everything for everyone involved in ways that no one could predict or control. Elizabeth Crane's third child, Thomas R., was born on December 3, 1957, and his arrival marked the beginning of the end for Margaret's 5-year deception. Thomas possessed the same distinctive Crane family features that had made Victoria's genetic heritage so obvious, creating a family portrait that made Robert III's anomalous appearance impossible to ignore or explain away through creative theories about recessive genetic traits. The impact was immediate and devastating. Robert Crane, faced with 3 children who should have shared similar family characteristics, could no longer deny that something was fundamentally wrong with his understanding of his eldest son's origins. His brother William's medical expertise provided the framework for questions that Robert had been suppressing for years, and within weeks of Thomas's birth, the Crane family was actively pursuing genetic testing that would expose the truth about Robert III's parentage. Margaret watched these developments with the sick fascination of someone witnessing the inevitable conclusion of a tragedy she had set in motion 5 years earlier. Every conversation with the Crane family became an exercise in maintaining composure while her world crumbled around her. The weight of her secret had become unbearable, but the complexity of the situation she had created made voluntary confession seem almost impossible to navigate successfully. The parallel investigation into Michael's background reached its own crisis point during the same period. Social services had uncovered enough inconsistencies in his placement documentation to warrant a comprehensive review of his case, including attempts to locate his biological mother for updated medical history information. The fictional identity Margaret had created for Sarah Mitchell was beginning to unravel under professional scrutiny, and the investigators were asking questions that could only be answered by admitting the truth about what had happened in 1952. Margaret's deteriorating mental and physical health made it increasingly difficult for her to manage the multiple deceptions that maintaining her secret required. Her supervisor at St. Mary's had placed her on administrative leave pending psychiatric evaluation, effectively removing her from the position that had given her access to medical records and professional credibility. Without her hospital affiliation, she found herself isolated and unable to monitor developments that could expose her actions. The breakthrough that would ultimately destroy her carefully constructed lies came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Weiss, motivated by maternal love and frustration, with the lack of information about Michael's background, had begun conducting her own investigation into his origins. Her persistent inquiries led her to Sarah Mitchell, who had never understood the true circumstances of her child's placement and was shocked to learn that the adoption Margaret had arranged had never actually occurred. Sarah's confusion about what had happened to her son created questions that could not be answered without revealing the truth about the switch. When Dorothy shared this information with social services, it triggered an investigation that would eventually connect Michael's case to irregularities in the records from St. Mary's maternity ward during November 1952. The convergence of these separate investigations created a perfect storm of revelation that Margaret could no longer control or influence. Her years of careful deception were unraveling simultaneously from multiple directions, and the complex web of lies she had woven was being systematically dismantled by people who had originally trusted her completely. The moment of truth came on February 14, 1958, when Margaret was summoned to meet with investigators from both the Social Services Department and the State Medical Board. Faced with evidence that made denial impossible, and confronted by the consequences of her actions for the first time in 5.5 years, she finally confessed to switching the babies during that storm-ravaged night in 1952. Her confession sent shockwaves through both families and the medical community. Robert and Elizabeth Crane learned that the child they had raised as their heir was actually the son of an unwed mother who had been raped by her stepfather. Dorothy and Harold Weiss discovered that the foster child they had loved and planned to adopt was actually the biological heir to one of Pennsylvania's wealthiest families. Sarah Mitchell learned that her son, whom she had believed was being raised by adoptive parents, was actually living as Robert Crane III and would inherit a fortune that should have been beyond her wildest dreams. The emotional devastation was immediate and comprehensive. Robert III, now 5 years old, was torn from the only family he had ever known and forced to adjust to circumstances that were completely foreign to his experience. Michael faced the equally traumatic transition from a modest foster home to luxury and privilege that he had never imagined possible. Both children struggled to understand changes that adults could barely comprehend themselves. Margaret's legal consequences were severe but somehow seemed inadequate compared to the psychological damage she had caused. She was charged with fraud, falsification of medical records, and child endangerment. Her nursing license was permanently revoked, and she faced the possibility of significant prison time. But the legal system's response to her crime seemed almost trivial compared to the human suffering that resulted from her well-intentioned intervention. The long-term consequences of the switch proved to be even more complex than anyone had anticipated. Robert III, now living with Sarah Mitchell under his given name of David, struggled to adapt to poverty and social circumstances that were dramatically different from everything he had known during his first 5 years. His artistic temperament and sensitivity, which had seemed problematic in the context of business inheritance, made adjustment to his new circumstances even more difficult. Michael, rechristened as Robert Crane III and thrust into the role of heir to a family fortune, found himself overwhelmed by expectations and social pressures that he had never been prepared to handle. His intellectual gifts, which had flourished in his foster family's supportive environment, became sources of additional pressure as family members demanded that he excel in ways that would validate their delayed recognition of his true identity. The psychological trauma affected both families in ways that lasted for decades. Robert and Elizabeth Crane struggled with guilt over their inability to love David as completely as they had loved the child they thought was their son. Their relationship with Michael was complicated by resentment over the lost years and confusion about how to relate to a child who was genetically their own, but emotionally a stranger. Dorothy and Harold Weiss grieved the loss of Michael as if he had died, because the child they had raised and planned to adopt was suddenly beyond their reach, elevated to social circumstances that made continued contact impossible. Their attempts to maintain relationships with Michael were complicated by class differences and legal restrictions that made regular visitation impractical. Sarah Mitchell found herself responsible for raising a child whose needs and expectations had been shaped by 5 years of luxury that she could never provide. David's adjustment difficulties and her own lack of resources created a situation that was far more challenging than the original circumstances she had faced as an unmarried mother in 1952. Margaret served 18 months in prison and was released in 1960 to find that both families had been permanently scarred by the consequences of her decision. Her attempts to apologize were rejected by everyone involved, and she spent the remaining decades of her life as a social pariah whose actions had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of playing God with other people's lives. The children's long-term development reflected the complexity of genetic inheritance versus environmental influence in ways that validated some of Margaret's original assumptions while contradicting others. David, despite his difficult adjustment to reduced circumstances, eventually developed his artistic talents and became a respected painter whose work reflected the sensitivity that had made him seem unsuited to business leadership. Michael succeeded in business and eventually expanded the Crane enterprises beyond what anyone had thought possible, but he struggled with identity issues and relationship problems that seemed connected to the trauma of his early displacement. Both men married and had children of their own, but their relationships with their offspring were complicated by their own experiences of family disruption and genetic confusion. The impact of Margaret's decision rippled through subsequent generations in ways that she could never have anticipated when she made her choice during that November night in 1952. The medical and social services communities used Margaret's case to develop new protocols for birth identification and record-keeping that made similar deceptions much more difficult to accomplish. The hospital implemented multiple verification systems for newborn identification, and social services developed more rigorous documentation requirements for child placements. But the human cost of Margaret's intervention remained incalculable. 2 families had been destroyed and rebuilt in configurations that satisfied no one completely. 4 adults had been forced to navigate relationships with children who were simultaneously their own and strangers. 2 children had been robbed of the opportunity to develop natural bonds with their biological families and forced to adapt to circumstances that felt foreign and uncomfortable throughout their entire childhoods. Margaret died alone in 1992, 40 years after making the decision that had defined her entire adult life. Her final years were spent in relative isolation, as neither family had been able to forgive her for the trauma her intervention had caused. Her obituary made no mention of the case that had made her notorious in medical and social services circles, but the people whose lives she had affected remembered her as a cautionary example of how good intentions could create consequences that exceeded the problems they were intended to solve. The switch Margaret had performed during that storm-ravaged night in 1952 had been motivated by compassion and a desire to address what she perceived as an injustice in the distribution of opportunity and resources between 2 newborns. But the reality of human development proved to be far more complex than her simple understanding of environmental versus genetic influence had suggested. The children she had tried to help were ultimately damaged by her intervention in ways that might have been avoided if she had allowed them to remain with their biological families, despite the apparent disadvantages that such placement would have entailed. The story of Margaret Holbrook serves as a reminder that the road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions, and that the decision to interfere with the natural order of human relationships carries consequences that can extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that motivate such interference. Her attempt to play God with the lives of 2 families resulted in decades of suffering that affected not just the children she had tried to protect, but every person who loved them and tried to help them navigate the complexities created by her deception. The weight of secrets, when they involve fundamental questions of identity and family relationships, proves to be unbearable, not just for the people who keep them, but for everyone whose lives are shaped by the lies that such secrets require. Margaret's 40-year burden of hidden truth ultimately destroyed more lives than it saved, demonstrating that love, when it motivates people to make decisions that should belong to others, can become a form of cruelty that exceeds the very injustices it seeks to address. So, what's your take on all this? Do you think Margaret's decision was an understandable act of compassion that unfortunately had tragic consequences? Or was it an inexcusable violation of trust that was doomed to cause more harm than good from the moment she made it? If you believe that the most well-intentioned decisions can sometimes create the most devastating consequences, make sure to subscribe to our channel, where we explore the complex moral territory where love and destruction intersect in ways that challenge everything we think we understand about right and wrong. And if this story has left you questioning the nature of family bonds and genetic destiny, share it with someone who appreciates the kind of complex human drama that reveals the darkest truths about the choices people make when they believe they're saving the ones they love.